Before we begin our journey on this peaceful night, take a moment to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment telling us where you're watching from. It's always delightful to discover where our listeners rest their heads as they travel with us through these old memories. Watch out below. It was a small village, one of those timeless places with alleys so narrow that the rooftops nearly touched overhead, and where stories traveled faster than the autumn winds. I vividly remember an elderly woman, stooped by years, named Brigida, or Brigida of the Chamberpot, as she came to be known after that infamous night. She lived on the second floor of a stone house and, as tradition and practicality dictated, emptied her chamber pot every morning from her back window, always accompanied by the ritual cry, "Watch out below." But that night, sleep overcame her heavily, perhaps lulled by valerian root tea or those old songs softly hummed by the fire. When the sky began to lighten with that pale blue tint before sunrise, Brigida opened her window, raised the old enameled chamber pot, and, in an automatic gesture, poured its contents without thinking. The problem was that young Tomas, the baker's apprentice known for taking silent shortcuts to reach the bakery, was passing directly beneath the window that early dawn. The poor boy had no time to pray, much less react. The impact was loud, liquid, and utterly irreversible. The street, which had slept under peaceful mist, awoke with a scream so genuine it silenced even the monastery's roosters. Tomas, hood plastered to his forehead and rainwater running down his back, ran like a ghost to the bakery, greeted by stifled laughter and wrinkled noses. Brigida, meanwhile, only noticed something had happened when she heard a distant, blessed curse mixed with echoes of laughter from down the street. That same afternoon, someone, they say it was the barber, who was also a poet in his idle hours, hung a parchment sheet on the tavern door bearing verses that sealed the old lady's fame and Tomas's misfortune. It read, "If passing without care beneath moonless air, take cloak, faith and luck, or a bath you shall wear." The village never forgot. From then on, the expression "being in the wrong place at the wrong time" gained a very specific fragrance there and a knowing laugh at every corner. Despite her initial embarrassment, Brigida eventually became an even more beloved figure. After all, who else would dare face their own mistake with a hoarse laugh and the remark, "Now I've learned, silence is more dangerous than the chamber pot." She began repeating her warning twice a day, just to be safe. "Watch out below and keep your memory sharp," drawing smiles from even the sternest faces. And Tomas, well, they say he began wearing a wide-brimmed hat and carefully watching windows, but also that his luck in love improved after the unexpected bath. It seems a certain laundress was charmed by his patience and resilience. The children, of course, loved the story. They performed it as theatre on the church square, reenacting the scene with empty buckets and cloths on their heads, always accompanied by the famous rhyming refrain. Even the monks at the abbey chuckled quietly when the topic arose. One even composed a psalm on the dangers of morning distractions, though no one took it very seriously. It was as if that wet morning had washed away not only poor Tomas, but also any hidden tension among neighbors. As years passed, the story took on legendary contours. People said that on thick, misty nights, one could still hear the echo of "Watch out below," drifting down empty alleys, as if time insisted on reminding the forgetful of the value of a simple warning. Brigida's house, now always with a slightly open window filled with marjoram pots, became a stopping point for visitors and travelers curious to see where the village's most famous involuntary bath originated. Tomas continued his life as a baker with a clean forehead and cautious steps. He married the laundress, had 3 children, and taught them all early on to look upward as they walked, and to laugh at themselves when the world chose to be unexpected. And Brigida, she lived to a very old age, always wrapped in a checkered shawl and holding a cup of hot tea. When asked about that morning, she smiled, eyes crinkled, and said, "It wasn't my fault. It was habit. And habit, my dear friends, always prevails, even over shame." Datu, in her later years, walking slowly and leaning on a cane carved with the image of a chamber pot, a gift from Thomas on her 60th birthday, Brigida became an unofficial counselor to the village's youth. Many approached her with broken hearts, doubts about arranged marriages, or frustrations with the price of eggs. She always listened calmly, blew on her tea, and softly advised, "You can choose when to open the window, but you'll never know who's passing beneath." It was her peculiar way of reminding them that everything in life demands attention and kindness. After her passing in a gentle, quiet winter, the village did something rare. It stopped completely for an entire day. Shops closed, bells tolled, and Thomas, now white-haired with curious grandchildren, recited in the village square the verses once laughed at, now solemn as a prayer. From the window flows the water, from memory flows laughter. He who fails to warn errs, but he who laughs endures ever after. And thus, amid winter flowers and raised mugs, the story of a distracted old lady and a drenched young man became legend, the kind that warms the heart even on the coldest nights. The shoe against the mud. I remember well that man with steady steps and broad hands, the old Raoul, a shoemaker by trade and guardian of the village's ankles. His shop, more like a nest of leather and smoke, was right on the bend of the main street, where the mud gathered as if it had a will of its own. They said the shoes that came out of there were made not just of soles and nails, but of pure stubbornness against the world's grime. It was a time when the mud seemed more persistent than blessings, and walking without slipping was almost a miracle. But Raoul, with the patience of a monk and a sure hammer, had found a way to fit the dignity of those who had to face the city stew, that infamous mix of rain, earth, and noise. They said he tested each boot in the trickiest part of the back alley, where not even cats dared venture after the rain. There, among mirrored puddles and slippery stones, the old shoemaker walked in silence, as if talking to the mud. His boots, thick and heavy, had waxed threaded soles, reinforced with an extra leather strip he proudly called the tongue against the stumble. And it wasn't an exaggeration. Some swore even the holes seemed to shrink back when those boots approached. But Raoul's fame wasn't born solely from the quality of his work, but from an episode that still draws muffled laughter on the chapel benches. It was a Sunday, with a light rain, the kind that doesn't scare, but silently muddies the world. Father Honorio, a serious man with long strides, was preparing to cross the courtyard to the pulpit when his old shoes, worn smooth by time, began to give way to the treacherous mud. It would have been a memorable fall, if not for the providential intervention of a new pair of boots Raoul had quietly left in the confessional days earlier as a silent gift to his old friend. The priest, initially reluctant to abandon his worn shoes, put on the boots only at the insistence of the parish housekeeper, who firmly said, "It's not a miracle you lack, Father, it's souls." And so, crossing the wet courtyard that Sunday, Honorio's steps remained steady, each step sinking with dignity but without slipping, as if a saint held his heels. The congregation, already seated on the benches, watched, some with closed eyes in prayer, others discreetly alert for a possible stumble, but all they saw was a sober, almost triumphant walk and a slight smile at the corner of the priest's lips. That same afternoon, after Mass, the rumor ran through the village like water down a crooked gutter. It was Raoul who saved the sermon, some said. Those boots tread mud like it was wheat, the bakery lady swore. And so, without ever having entered any pulpit, Raoul became part of the parish's stories, cited among psalms and whispers as the man who faced the mud and won. His workshop began receiving not only peasants and coachmen, but also gentlemen in tailcoats, and even a curious bishop who ordered 2 pairs, one for himself and another for the guardian angel if he accepts earthly shoes. Raoul, as always, said nothing. He just calmly measured feet, traced patterns on raw leather, and let the hammer sing its work song, tap, tap, like a patient heart. There was something almost sacred in his silence, as if each boot told a silent prayer, sewn between the fibers, waiting only for the right mud to reveal itself. And with every new pair delivered, it was as if he told the world, walk on, the ground no longer commands you. Over time, his boots became known for a discreet detail, 3 red stitch dots on the heel, like a secret seal. Some said it was artisan superstition. Others swore it was a stitched blessing. Raoul, however, never explained. When asked, he only smiled wryly and kept hammering, letting the leather and silence answer for themselves. And so, between mud and laughter, faith and rust, the old shoemaker wove his legend in the footsteps of those who passed by. It was during a particularly treacherous winter that his fame found new breath. The melting snow had turned the streets into mirrors of dark mud, and not even horses trusted their own steps. On the morning of St. Bartholomew's feast, the procession hesitated to leave. The saint's image awaited, covered in cloths, while the acolytes trembled more from nerves than cold. Then Donna Villeta, a matriarch known to fear neither priest nor master, knocked on the shoemaker's door with a basket of eggs and a direct request. 3 pairs by noon, Raoul, or St. Bartholomew will stop on the ground. Without a word, he nodded. His calloused fingers moved like someone praying, quick, sure, accustomed to the passing of time and leather. And as the tower bell rang, 3 acolytes left the workshop with still warm boots on their feet, exuding the smell of polish and promise. The procession went on firmly, the boots treading the mud like oak roots, and that day no one slipped. Neither the youngest boy nor the old sacristan who had limped since last winter. They say even the saint smiled in his golden frame, and maybe he really did. After all, even the heavens know how to recognize a good pair of boots. After that, orders began arriving even from neighboring villages, brought by messengers with soaked feet and stories in their eyes. Some said Raoul's boots could bear the weight of the world. Others told of a traveler who crossed a flooded field and arrived dry from the ankle down, which in those parts was practically a miracle. But Raoul didn't care for rumors. He stayed in his workshop, where the smell of leather mingled with damp firewood, where each pair of boots took shape under the trembling light of an old lamp and the shy whistle of a nameless song. Sometimes I visited him as a boy, curious about the dance of waxed threads and the light steam rising from the shoemaker's stew in the corner of the forge. He let me watch as long as I didn't speak much, and I learned in the silence. I learned there is art in the craft, and tenderness even in something as rough as raw leather. I remember one afternoon he gave me a small round scrap and said simply, "Step firmly, even if the world gives way." At the time, I didn't understand. Today, I keep that scrap as one keeps an ancient piece of advice, the kind that only reveals itself when it rains hard. Time passed, as it always does, carrying away the colors of hair and the vigor of mornings. But Raoul remained stubborn as the cobblestones, shaping boots, even when his hands trembled a little and his eyes blinked too often before the flame. The village, grateful, cared for him as one cares for an old oak, with respect, reverence, and a certain tenderness hidden among practical gestures. The bakery's bread arrived warm, silently left on the doorstep. The milkman took the longest route just to avoid noise near the workshop window where the shoemaker still slept. Once the new priest, a thin young man who seemed to read more than step in the mud, slipped badly on the square's bend. He wasn't hurt, but lost a shoe in the puddle, and with it, much of his dignity. The next Sunday, Raoul left a new pair in the sacristy, smaller than Honorio's, but with the same firm sole and the 3 red dots on the heel. The young priest, still stumbling over words during homilies, stepped down from the altar that day with sure steps and a quiet smile, as if discreetly embraced by the village's own story. And everyone understood the blessing didn't come only from the pulpit, but also from a well-made soul that walks firmly on the ground. That night after Mass, I found Raoul sitting on the workshop doorstep, his apron resting beside him like an old tired friend. The lamp's light carved lines on his face, and the silence around was as thick as the sweet smell of freshly tanned leather. I sat beside him without a word, as I had learned as a child. He offered me a piece of dried apple, hard but sweet, and together we listened to the village sleep. The creak of a door, a distant dog dreaming, the wind sweeping the mud from the street like a distracted storyteller. After a while, Raoul spoke, almost as if to himself. It takes respect to make something that can bear the world. It's not the stitching that holds, it's the intention. I kept that without fully understanding, like keeping a seed in a torn pocket. Much later, I realized he wasn't just talking about boots, but about life, about care in every small gesture, the silent endurance that sustains the days without asking for anything in return. In the village, no one knew exactly how many pairs of boots Raoul had made. They only knew that when it rained and the ground became a muddy mirror, he was the one who kept steps steady. And when winter came harder than expected, with thick frosts and fog swallowing chimneys at dawn, it was in Raoul's boots the village trusted. Parents knocked at his door before sunrise, children wrapped in blankets waiting for the missing pair, and even with stiff fingers and blurred sight, Raoul refused no one. He stitched in silence, calm-eyed, as if talking to time. They said the cold didn't enter his shoes. Even the calluses thanked him, and when an old coachman claimed to have crossed 3 valleys with dry socks, no one doubted. The shoemaker's reputation was tougher than his own nails. Over the years, Raoul slowed down. The forge cooled earlier, and the pile of leather waited for days that didn't always come. An apprentice, kind and curious, began helping him. A young man with steady hands and attentive eyes who knew how to listen more than speak. Raoul taught him with gestures and silences, just as I had learned. And so his art passed from hand to hand, as if each stitch carried something invisible, a thread of memory, an echo of one who never fell because he had somewhere solid to step. The village knew. When clouds darkened and the mud took over again, it was Raoul's boots, or those of his students, that everyone trusted. In the spring that followed, when the rain ceased and the fields timidly bloomed among dry puddles, Raoul hung up his hammer. Not as one giving up, but as one who knows when to fall silent, so others can speak. The workshop stayed open, now run by the young apprentice named Pedro, who kept every master's precept like prayers. The smell of leather, the steady thump of the hammer, the flickering lamp in the corner, all still there. And in a simple gesture, Pedro kept the custom of the 3 little red dots on the heel, in silence, never saying why. One night, lying in my wooden bed beneath the soft creak of the wind on the tiles, I heard heavy footsteps on the wet street. Not hurried or noisy steps, but firm, confident ones. They were Raoul's boots, I knew immediately, even knowing he no longer walked there. Maybe it was Pedro, maybe someone he had shod with hope. But that night, with the smell of rain coming through the window and sleep approaching like an old friend, I was sure Raoul's memory would live wherever mud tried to trip someone. Because there are shoes that protect the feet, and others, rarer ones, that protect the whole path. And so I fell asleep, rocked by memories of steps in the mud and stories sown in silence. I dreamed of the workshop, of leather hanging from the beams, of the hammer rhythm like a heart that never tires. I dreamed of Raoul, not old, but serene, with a clean apron and eyes glowing like a discreet ember. He smiled without saying a word, as he always did, and in his hands held a small pair of boots, new, still warm from the last stitch. He offered them to me as one who gives much more than protection, as one who gives a piece of what keeps the world steady. And when I woke, with the soft dawn light filtering through the cracks, the village sound seemed softer, more certain. Outside, someone was already sweeping the mud off the sidewalks. A bell rang in the distance, and I knew with that quiet certainty that only comes in the early hours that while there is mud, there will be someone sowing resilience. While there are slippery paths, there will be steps prepared by ancient hands, and from time to time, a pair of boots can do more than prevent a fall. It can uphold dignity, preserve faith, and teach that even the trickiest ground bows before care. That day, crossing the square, I noticed the heels of the people. An old man carrying firewood wore darkened leather boots with the red stitches still visible under the dust. A girl ran after a puppy, and in her small custom-made shoes, I saw the same trio of delicately embroidered dots. Even the priest, not the clumsy young man anymore, but a more mature man with steady steps, walked with the same soles Raoul had left years before, now lightly worn but still firm, still faithful. And I finally understood what Raoul had built. Not just boots, nor just a workshop or a trade. He had woven, stitch by stitch, a kind of silent pact with time and mud, that falling is human, but walking with dignity is art. And this art, passed hand to hand, sown between generations, lived on in the steps marking the wet ground of that village. A legacy not of leather, but of courage. Not of nails, but of permanence. And in every firm step on the mud, there he was, the shoemaker of serene silence, who taught everyone that sometimes a simple pair of boots can prevent a fall and raise a story. And then, like every good memory told at the edge of sleep, I let this story rest too, like boots resting by the door at the end of the day, covered in dry mud and memories. Old Raoul, I believe, never sought to be remembered. But some gestures, like sewing with care, like quietly fitting someone's feet, become unforgettable even without intention. If one day you walk through an old village where the mud still challenges steps, watch the heels that pass by. And if you find 3 small red dots embroidered near the sole, smile. Someone still walks firmly where many would slip. And maybe, just maybe, the shoe against the mud is still there, beating the mud, one step at a time. Good night, traveler. May your feet find firm ground, and your dreams, stories as gentle as this, until the next memory, wax noses. That particular winter, the winds came denser, carrying the world's odors with an honesty the nobles pretended not to notice. The narrow city streets, filled with lime and rust, exhaled a bittersweet mix of smoke, animals, and hurried life. But up high, behind thick glass windows and embroidered curtains, there was a small secret among the ladies of the court, a subtle, almost poetic ritual to survive the harshness of the sense of smell. It was wax, small cones delicately molded, soaked in oils of lavender, myrrh, or sandalwood, gently placed inside the nostrils as if keeping a flower in an invisible vase. I remember the first time I saw my aunt, the Marquise of Villeneuve, adjust hers in front of the mirror. Her fingers were agile, trained like those of an experienced embroiderer. The gesture was as elegant as it was uncomfortable, but no one dared laugh. Those little towers of fragrance, disguised beneath lace veils and haughty glances, were more than fashion. They were defense, against the outside world, against the vulgarity of common smells, and perhaps against the reminder that behind perfumes, the world remained impure and noisy. She said noble noses should never be offended, neither by harsh words nor unwanted vapors. And there was something almost enchanting in that belief, as if the sense of smell could be trained to dream, not just to react. The little wax cone was delicately molded by maidservants who mixed purified tallow with dried petals, and the scent that emanated was like an invisible reliquary kept within the very face itself. It was strange, I admit, yet, as with so many eccentricities of high society, there was a certain poetry in it. It was not uncommon to see ladies walking the manor's halls with lost gazes and serene expressions, as if they inhabited scented gardens, even when the morning winds brought the stench of smoked fish or distant stables into the great hall. What was discomfort for others became distinction for them. Elegance, said the vainest among them, is not only visual, it is olfactory too. Thus was born a silent game of aromas and disguises, where each lady competed not only in the beauty of her dress, but in the subtlety of the hidden perfume that insinuated itself among sighs and smiles. Some even swore it was possible to recognize a lady merely by the scent of her wax, as if love could bloom not by a glance, but by a perfumed breath of jasmine or grey amber. Some chose citrus essences to seem youthful. Others preferred resinous woods to suggest mystery and melancholy. I recall a visit to a baroness's house in Avignon, whose reputation was built entirely on the aromas surrounding her. It was said no one remembered her voice or laugh precisely, only the subtle scent of clove and lavender lingering in the air after her departure. But there were also little discomforts, of course. What began as delicacy soon became a persistent nuisance. The wax, if poorly made, melted under the heat of the balls, leaving golden traces on handkerchiefs or lace of dresses. Some ladies, more proud than practical, refused to remove it even during long dinners, preferring silent tears of burning rather than admitting they were suffocated by their own refinement. It was a kind of voluntary sacrifice in the name of grace, a fragrant penance dressed in vanity. Once, during a supper in honor of the Duke of Foix, a young countess fainted discreetly between the second and third courses. Suspicion naturally fell on her rosemary and camphor wax, which obstructed more than her senses. It suffocated her soul, said the most poetic tongues. But instead of shame, there was admiration. After all, fainting from excess elegance was, in certain circles, almost a compliment. Fashion, as so often in history, did not seek comfort, but illusion. And in those times, the illusion of floating above the vulgar world was a daily necessity. For us, who grew up among hay and ovens, it seemed strange. But over time, we learned to understand that gesture as one understands a poem, not by logic, but by the desire it carries. It was a way of denying reality, perfuming hardships, dressing daily life with a golden varnish of fantasy. The world outside might stink of fish, sweat and dust, but inside every adorned nose was a secret garden, invisible and unreachable, where only what the soul wished to smell could enter. And perhaps deep down, wasn't that the very essence of nobility? To choose what to feel, even when the world insists on pushing the opposite. There was a particular silence that accompanied these women as they walked the streets with their hidden wax. A perfumed silence, as if the very air around bowed respectfully to their fantasy. Merchants murmured as they passed, servants averted their eyes, and even dogs hesitated before barking. It was not fear nor reverence. It was something more delicate, like the recognition that these ladies did not entirely belong to that world of mud and smoke. They floated, even with their feet on the ground, supported by small wax cones and a stubborn desire for beauty. And in their chambers at night, they removed the adornments with delicate gestures, as if undoing a spell. The wax, now warm and pliable, was wrapped in scented linen and kept as a precious secret. Some, more sentimental, had little boxes just for that, small relics of their days, impregnated with the scent of youth, of the feast, of the sigh held in the hall. I remember an elderly lady who once showed me one of those old cones, with a faint smile and eyes full of longing. "It was violet," she said. "I wore it the autumn I danced with him." And in that moment, I understood. It wasn't just perfume. It was memory kept by the nose. These aromatic memories had a curious way of lingering. Even years later, when crossing a field of violets or smelling a trace of amber in some forgotten tapestry, the ladies would travel back in time, not through sight or sound, but by scent. It was as if the soul breathed first before any other part of the body. Some women cried quietly while preparing their new waxes, not for the fragrance itself, but for what it promised. A moment of eternity suspended in the air, a brief return to the night when everything seemed possible under the flickering candlelight. With time, of course, customs changed. Perfumes became subtler, noses less willing to carry the weight of elegance, and halls more airy. But I still remember clearly the delicate sound of a lady inhaling for the last time before leaving, as if taking a breath, not for the real world, but for the world she chose to inhabit. And even now, on cold nights when the wind carries forgotten scents of wet earth and embers sleeping in the stove, I sometimes find myself wishing for a small wax cone scented with old roses, not to shield me from the world's smells, but to remind me that once to be elegant was also an act of gentle resistance. I still remember a phrase my grandmother used on days when the air seemed denser and the world grayer. "It's a wax nose day." And even after fashion passed, the phrase remained among us as a symbol for the days when everything outside seemed too much, too noisy, too smelly, too real. It was her way of saying that sometimes it's necessary to retreat gently, to seek an invisible shelter made of memories, fragrances, and chosen silences. A simple, almost childish gesture of hiding in what is beautiful, even if just for a moment. Today, as I watch the faint flame of the fireplace dance against the stone wall, I think of all those women who shaped their noses and their worlds with a handful of wax and a stubborn desire to dream. They knew they couldn't change what was outside, the smell of markets, horses, and rotten rain in the alleys. But they could choose what to bring inside. And so they did, silent and stubborn, with their garden perfumes and paper hopes. And perhaps that is, after all, the noblest of all freedoms, the freedom to choose with which memory to perfume the world. Sometimes, when the nights become too long and the present seems cold and scentless, I return to think of them, the ladies with light steps and attentive eyes, who walked as if treading on a floor made of petals rather than stone. It wasn't mere affectation, as many said disdainfully. It was a kind of personal magic, a silent enchantment that says, "I will not let the world harden me." Each gesture, each hidden fragrance was a vow of softness before a time rarely kind. And if there is one thing I learned from those women, with their silver boxes full of wax and promises, it is that there is always a secret path between the harshness of the world and the comfort of the soul. Sometimes it begins with a simple gesture, shaping a little perfume with the hands and placing in the nose the memory of something better, something purer, calmer, something that perhaps never truly existed but lives nonetheless within us. And when I close my eyes, I can almost feel the gentle morning breeze, the distant murmur of bells, and that discreet lavender scent hanging like a secret in the air. And it is in that imagined scent that I often fall asleep, cradled not by songs, but by memories never mine, and yet still belonging to me. Because there is an infinite tenderness in remembering what others lived with grace, even when the world was hostile. These women, with their discreetly perfumed noses, taught without words that resisting harshness does not require strength, only beauty placed in the right places. Inside the nose, for example, or inside the heart. So, if today you feel the world heavy, impatient, rude, imagine yourself for a moment in a chamber of tapestries and candlelight, adjusting a small scented wax cone with delicate fingers. Choose your scent, old rose, amber, nutmeg, and breathe softly. Leave the world outside. Here inside there is only calm, only a time that passes without haste. And deep down, perhaps that is what those ladies sought all along. Not just elegance, but peace, an enchanted breath within chaos. Good night. And may your dreams come perfumed, the smoke of herbs. I recall clearly that afternoon, when the autumn mist mingled with the bluish smoke rising from the embers on the beaten earth. I was still a boy, curious and easily impressed, tasked with helping the herbal brothers prepare for the communal meal. In the small stone village where I grew up, among hills covered with chestnut trees and the constant whisper of hidden streams, it was an old custom to burn dried leaves and aromatic herbs before every meal. They said it warded off evil vapors, the miasmas that hovered over noses and souls, and that it also soothed the atmosphere, making the bread lighter and the soup more honest. There was something magical in that gesture, the way the brothers, in aprons stained by time and hands covered in flour dust, placed small bundles of rosemary, rue, and sometimes lavender onto the embers. The smoke rose in slow spirals, like prayers uncertain of their addressee. The scent was strong but not unpleasant. It evoked cleanliness, silence, and the invisible presence of ancient knowledge. No one dared eat before the air was properly cleared, as they said. It was more than a ritual. It was care. And that day, like many others, we let ourselves be carried away by too much zeal. But on that particular day, zeal took the form of excess. One of the younger brothers, Brother Osvaldo, always enthusiastic and with fingers too quick, decided to reinforce the burning with sage leaves and a generous handful of dry moss he had found near the walls of the old chapel. To drive away even the most stubborn sins, he said, with a mischievous gleam in his eyes. The problem was that moss, unlike the aromatic leaves, burned fiercely. In an instant, the smoke that usually danced lazily over the hearth turned into restless flames that licked the floor and threatened the fabrics hanging beside the entrance. The rush was silent but desperate. No one dared shout inside the chapel, not even when the fire licked the white linen mantle hanging near the altar. We ran for buckets, wet cloths, anything that would allow us to save not only the sacred space, but also our reputation before the elders. Brother Severino, the eldest among us, took the lead with a calmness that belied his wide eyes. With the wooden staff he always carried, he struck the embers as one tames a disobedient animal, and miraculously the flames yielded. Only the acrid smell of smoke remained, a black trace on the stone floor, and a story that would echo in nervous laughter for months to come. After that episode, we began to burn the herbs with even greater reverence, and perhaps a bit more common sense. Brother Osvaldo was spared severe reprimands. After all, none of the old stained glass had broken, and even the priest the following Sunday alluded to the spiritual fire we sometimes needed to renew our faith. But the truth is, we all started to observe the smoke more closely. We noticed how it moved, how it floated toward the roof beams, how it sometimes seemed to draw ancient faces or dissipate before words whispered with respect. Burning herbs was no longer just a custom. It had become a dance between care and trust, and there was something deeply serene in that balance. The aromas continued to perfume our meals, but were now preceded by a brief silence, as if each person awaited the ember's consent before feeding them. The leaves were chosen more carefully, tied in small bundles with hemp twine, and offered to the flame with devoted hands. Some said that smoke, when well guided, carried not only evil vapors but also small grievances and heavy thoughts. And at night, when I lay down on the narrow straw cot, I still felt in my hair the lingering smell of rue, and with it a strange and sweet feeling of protection. Once, at dusk, a traveler passed through the village, a man of low speech and tired eyes, who carried in his bag a collection of dried leaves, carefully wrapped in embroidered cloths. He said he came from the south, where monks mixed wild rose petals with aromatic wood chips, creating a smoke that cured insomnia and warded off bad dreams. Curious, the brothers welcomed him, and that night we let him lead the ritual. When the embers began to crackle under the pink petals, an unusual silence fell upon us. The smoke was more delicate than what we were used to, but carried a sweet and almost melancholic perfume, like an old memory. It was that night I understood, perhaps for the first time, that there was something profoundly human in those smokes rising before the meal. It was not just superstition, nor mere habit. It was a form of presence, a reminder that the invisible world, made of scents, whispers, and repeated gestures, also deserved to be nourished. The traveler left at dawn, leaving behind a handful of petals and a simple piece of advice. Burn with intention, not in haste. We never saw him again, but for years we continued to alternate our local herbs with a handful of his, as one adds memory to the embers. Over the years, the ritual became more intimate, almost like a silent conversation between fire and time. Some afternoons, especially in the longest winters, the elder brothers brought bundles of marjoram and dried fig leaves, whispering that certain plants spoke better to the soul when the wind blew from the east. No one questioned. They simply bowed before the fire with half-closed eyes, as if listening to something too ancient to explain. And I, who in youth thought it all exaggerated, began to perceive how those smokes seemed to have a will of their own, circling faces, slipping through cracks in the walls, resting on shoulders like invisible hands. There was one evening, many years after the near fire, when the chapel was illuminated by an unexpected golden glow, not from candles, but from smoke. The bundles had been prepared for the feast of St. William, and each brought from home a handful of the plant that most reminded them of childhood. When the embers received that heap of memories, the smoke rose thick, perfumed with lavender, nutmeg, orange leaves, and even some lemon balm gathered near the well. The light filtering through the stained glass tinged the air in soft colors, and for a moment, the chapel floor seemed to float beneath our feet. That night, no one spoke loudly. The soup was served in silence, and even the cutlery, usually noisy in impatient hands, seemed to move with respect. The smoke still danced, slow, as if wanting to stay with us a little longer, and on the faces was a kind of serenity hard to find in hurried days. The younger brothers, who until then treated the custom as a pretty curiosity, looked at the embers with eyes of those who finally understood there was more than aroma. There was memory, protection, and an invisible thread linking who we were to who we became, year after year. Since then, every time I smell burning leaves, whether in a field at dusk or in the timid breath of incense at a forgotten window, something inside me rests, as if part of my soul knows exactly where to return. And even though times have changed, and meals now come without smoke, without chapels, without embers on the beaten earth, I still keep with me that simple gesture. To light with tenderness, burn with care, and offer to the air not only scent, but memory. For in every wisp of smoke there is a path, and in every path, a home that never fades. The monk and the mint mask. Long, long ago, when monastery walls still wore silence like a second skin, and the scent of dried herbs mingled with the soft sounds of vespers, there was a monk, calm as a lake on a misty night, distinguished by his discreet kindness and eyes always half closed, as if contemplating an invisible secret. He was called Brother Renatus, though few dared to call him by any name, for he spoke little and preferred to smile with his eyes. His habit was simple, his steps light, and his days repeated with the silent cadence of the canonical bells marking the hours. But there was something curious about that gentle man, a certain freshness that accompanied him, even in the stifling heat of the cloisters. Soft breaths of mint came from him, discreet, almost imperceptible, as if he carried a hidden garden in his chest. Until one novice, curious as only the very young can be, discovered the secret. And so began the brief and almost legendary story of the mint mask. They said Brother Renatus, during his long hours of copying and contemplation, discreetly suffered from the monastery's odors, not out of vanity but sensitivity. The ancient cloisters, though sacred, exhaled a persistent mixture of burnt candles, aged parchment, and the resigned sweat of dozens of men who prayed more than they washed their tunics. Then one morning, while gathering herbs in the garden for the infirmary's infusion, he had an idea as simple as it was strange. He sewed a fine linen mask and filled its folds with fresh mint leaves, chosen with the care of a monk and the silence of a poet. There was nothing extravagant about the object. It was modest, pale as the penitent's robes, and tied to the face with a thin ribbon barely visible beneath the hood. But the effect was enchanting. When breathing, the monk was enveloped by a subtle breeze, a clean aroma that seemed to open windows inside the chest. More than comfort, it was a kind of sensory prayer. And without ever uttering a word, Renatus began to inspire curious glances and whispered questions among the novices, who saw in that mask a small miracle hidden beneath the veil of discipline. Then the fashion, if we may call it that, began to spread through the stone corridors. First one, then 3, soon 7 young novices appeared at matins, wearing their own versions of the mask. Some were made of raw hemp, others of old sheet scraps, but all contained freshly picked mint leaves, folded with almost reverent care. And suddenly, between psalms and silences, the monastery air became curiously aromatic, not with incense, but with the invigorating sweetness of a garden wet by morning dew. The older monks frowned. The abbot ignored it at first, judging it a passing whim of the inexperienced, but the corridors began to smell less of penance and more like an herb market. What was a personal gesture of comfort gradually became a small rebellion of fabric and green leaves. The novices wore the masks not only to escape odors, but because somehow they felt lighter, more awake, as if the mint blew little invisible blessings with every breath. Naturally, as with almost all innocent joys, enchantment soon met resistance. One morning, climbing the steps to the refectory, Brother Renatus found a notice posted on the chapter room door, written with the firmness of an impatient pen. The use of nasal adornments, scented fabrics, or any item distracting from inner recollection is forbidden. Vanity, even aromatic, is a deviation. The term nasal vanity became, for the younger ones, cause for muffled laughter, but also a sign that mint was no longer welcome on monastic faces. Renatus did not protest. He simply bowed his head, as if accepting that even the gentlest winds may be misunderstood. He folded his mask with a calm gesture carefully, as if it were a sacred page. The novices, for their part, tried to resist silently, using dry leaves hidden in pockets, chewing them during offices, or sewing small sachets inside their habits. But soon the superiors noticed and called them one by one to discuss discipline and detachment. Thus, little by little, the fashion faded like a flower out of season. Still, for a brief and almost forgotten summer, that monastery was filled with soft aromas and restrained laughter, with light steps leaving invisible traces of freshness. Some even said prayers sounded clearer then, that novices slept better, and even old books seemed less heavy under the constant breath of mint. But that, of course, was never recorded in official chronicles, only in the knowing smiles exchanged among those who lived through that curious episode. Over the years, the story of the mint mask became an internal legend told among new initiates with mystery and nostalgia. And Brother Renatus, he continued his silence, as always. He never wore his invention again, but sometimes when going out alone to gather herbs, he carried a small piece of white cloth which he carefully folded over the green leaves before placing them in the basket. No one asked. And he, with eyes that knew how to smile silently, let the wind spread a light perfume through the corridors, as if tenderly saying, "Some ideas never truly die. There was a particularly harsh winter years later when the bells tolled slower and silence seemed even thicker in the cold corridors. It was then that one of the youngest novices, a thin boy with restless eyes named Tomas, fell ill. It was not serious, they said, just a persistent cough and a fatigue that would not pass. Still, he shivered at night, even with 3 blankets and a candle burning beside the cot. Then Renatus, already bent with years and almost forgotten by the younger ones, appeared at the infirmary door with a simple bundle in hand. Inside, a square of linen, yellowed by time, and some mint leaves discreetly picked from the walled garden. He said nothing. He simply handed the gift with a lingering look and a gentle gesture, as one returns a memory to its origin. Tomas wore the mask that night, and they say he slept peacefully for the first time in many moons, breathing as if the summer fields had returned inside the room. The next morning, the whisper of freshness still seemed to hang in the infirmary air, like a secret shared between cold walls and worn sheets. Tomas awoke with a faint sparkle in his eyes and a light smile, something rare in such hard and austere times. There was no fuss, no formal celebration, just the silent warmth of one who knows a small gesture can carry the weight of great grace. And so, within the ancient walls and the constant murmur of prayers, the mint mask came to be remembered not as an object of vanity, but as a symbol of care. A simple gift that spoke louder than words, a breath of comfort in long, cold nights. And while the wind continued to dance through the leaves, it carried with it the certainty that even in silence, tenderness always finds a way to bloom. In the silence following Vespers, when the world seems to rest beneath a mantle of silent stars, there is an ancient comfort renewed in small things, in gentle gestures, in calming scents, in delicate touches that warm the soul. Brother Renatus and his mint mask remind us that even the austere spaces can hold fragrances of hope and rest. And so, dear listener, as your eyes slowly close and the night cradles your dreams, allow the freshness of that gentle herb to envelop you like an old embrace, invisible yet real. May you find rest, like a monk in his monastery, rocked by perfumed memories and the welcoming silence that only history can offer. Good night, and may your sleep be as light and serene as the whisper of mint leaves in the wind, when the rain took everything. I remember that grey morning when the sky decided to pour down on our village like never before. The rain, a relentless torrent, spared nothing in its path, seeping between the stones of the streets, carrying with it a river of secrets and stories we never wished to hear. The smell was strong, a mix of mud, dirty water, and what time had forgotten in the gutters. And surprisingly, instead of murmurs of complaint, the village was filled with a silent determination. As the water invaded the houses and washed the walls, people began to raise higher gutters, turning each roof into an ally against the misfortunes the storm imposed. The adults sang together, their firm voices cutting through the noise of the rain, chanting what soon came to be known as the Rivers of Shame. It was a simple melody, yet full of humor and resistance, speaking of waters invading kitchens, objects floating like small makeshift boats, and the inevitable mess that became part of life. Children watched with wide eyes as the water danced slowly down the corridors, carrying away what it could, but leaving behind a valuable lesson. Complaining would change nothing, but together they could rebuild, adapt, and even celebrate this untamable force of nature. In that wooden and clay house where I grew up, the courtyard turned into a small reservoir while the family gathered near the fireplace, listening to the incessant drumming of the downpour outside. The smoke rose lazily, blending with the damp smell that filled the air. Between sips of hot tea, my grandmother told ancient stories of other floods, as if the waters carried memories and secrets kept for generations. Even with everything wet and the floor slippery, there was comfort in silent unity, a calm certainty that, after the storm, the sun would always smile again upon the village. The sound of the rain was almost hypnotic, an invisible drum marking the rhythm of the day, as each person worked calmly to repair what could be saved. The boards that gave way were replaced with sturdier ones. The gutters, now higher, took shape under calloused hands, and the doors were reinforced with extra planks to prevent the next downpour from being so merciless. There was no room for despair, for medieval life had already taught that nature was a stern but wise teacher, and from it came humility and adaptation. Amid this labor, the village seemed like an orchestra of coordinated voices and steps, each corner, each gesture, a note in the silent symphony of survival. Laughter, shy but present, sprang up among conversations and comments about the unusual spectacle of rivers of shame running down neighbors' windows and doors. It was a way to lighten the heavy, a reminder that despite difficulties, the human spirit always found a reason to celebrate, sing, and resist. In the nights that followed, the village seemed transformed. The raised gutters, tall and sturdy, were not just barriers against rain, but monuments to the resilience of those who, facing chaos, found the strength to create. The scent of freshly cut wood mingled with that of dry hay, while conversations about the storm waned and gave way to plans for a more cautious yet hopeful future. Sitting by the fireplace, I watched the flames dance and reflect in the eyes of those who, despite calloused hands and faces marked by time, carried in their hearts the lightness of those who learned to dance with the waters rather than drown in them. It was a time of acceptance, of understanding that however much the rivers of shame might flow, they always pass, leaving behind renewed earth and a village ready to move forward. The sun returned to shine with an almost shy delicacy, filtering its first rays through the remaining clouds still hanging on the horizon. The puddles reflected small inverted worlds where birds drank and children found new toys in the wet leaves. The earth, though soaked, exhaled a refreshing freshness, and the walls of the houses dried slowly as if breathing relief along with their inhabitants. Around, faces once marked by worry now lit up with contained smiles, while voices resumed the chant of the rivers of shame, no longer as a lament, but as a hymn of overcoming. It was a gentle reminder that life, even in its fiercest storms, carries the promise of new beginnings, sometimes wrapped in the sound of rain and the dance of waters. The children, who before had watched silently, now ran freely through the muddy paths, their laughter mixing with the sound of the creek, which, though furious, began to calm. They gathered small pieces of wood and leaves, making boats that sailed through those rivers of shame, with the innocence of those who do not yet understand the gravity of the events, but know how to appreciate the beauty of flowing water. In the midst of this scene of rebirth, families gathered in small groups, exchanging stories and solutions to prevent the next rain from catching them unprepared. It was a time of shared learning, where every higher gutter, every reinforced corner, represented not only physical protection, but a bond of unity and renewed hope for all who called that village home. As the days passed, nature seemed to participate in this healing process as well. The grass green sprouted more vibrant among the heaps of turned earth, and the shy flowers that braved the storms now bloomed with an even sweeter fragrance, as if celebrating the silent strength of those who lived there. The wind, once a threatening whisper, had become a gentle breeze that caressed tired faces, bringing promises of peaceful days. Meanwhile, the raised gutters on the houses gained small decorations. Pieces of colorful fabric, simple symbols made with branches and flowers, as if those structures were more than protection against rain, but also guardians of the memories of that storm. And at dusk, the singing of the villagers was heard again, a sweet murmur speaking of overcoming, of laughter, and of life that goes on, always renewed. As nights came, the village sank into serene silence, interrupted only by the distant croak of frogs and the rustling of leaves caressed by the wind. Under the faint moonlight, shadows danced on the stone walls, while dreams, cradled by ancient stories and whispers from the past, carried the inhabitants away from memories of the storm. And so, in that calm, tired bodies and strengthened souls rested. Because in the end, it was not the water that defined that place, but the courage with which its people faced it. Between the high gutters and the soft songs, life found its way, gentle as the whisper of the breeze and firm as the roots that sustained that land. The following days brought a renewed rhythm, a harmony between man and nature that seemed sealed by the storm. Calloused hands worked side by side, sometimes repairing roofs, sometimes cultivating the wet earth, as if each gesture were a silent prayer that the next rain would be gentle and generous, not destructive. And even on the coldest nights when the wind sang ancient songs through the window cracks, human warmth was present in every home. Families gathered around the fire, sharing stories that mingled with the crackling flames, finding comfort in each other's presence and in the certainty that, despite the challenges, they were together, always together, in this journey through life. At times, amid the cozy silence of the night, the soft murmur of the river was heard, flowing peacefully far away, indifferent to the village's trials. It was a subtle reminder that, like the waters, life too continues its flow, carrying away pains and bringing new hopes with each dawn. And in windows lit by the warm glow of candles, the shadows of people stretched, projecting images of calm and perseverance. It was in that environment, as simple as it was profound, that I perceived the true spirit of our community. Not a place immune to storms, but a home where the strength of love and solidarity turned the rivers of shame into rivers of life. Over time, the stories of that storm became part of the village's living memory, told and retold around the fireplace on cold nights, cradling dreams and teaching the young about the resilience dwelling in every heart. The songs of the rivers of shame ceased to be mere laments and became symbols of courage and unity, melodies connecting past to present with softness and hope. And so, even when the sky once again filled with heavy clouds, no one feared the rain anymore. They knew that no matter how strong the waters, the village and its people were prepared, not only with raised gutters and reinforced walls, but with a soul that knew how to sing, laugh, and resist, always ready for the next dawn. On days when clouds began to gather on the horizon, there was a respectful silence among the villagers, a silence heavy with memories and learning. The children, now a little older, looked at the sky with curiosity and without fear, knowing that whatever the strength of the storm, it would find a village ready to welcome it with steady arms and open hearts. And when the first drop fell, there was no rush, no despair, only the gentle sound of water kissing the earth, the whisper of renewed hope that followed each rain. Thus, among stories, songs, and the dance of waters, life followed its course, delicate and resilient, like the eternal murmur of rivers that carry with them memories of a time never forgotten. In the quietest moments, when the village seemed suspended between yesterday and tomorrow, the raised gutters served not only to divert the water, but to remind everyone of the strength born of unity. It was there that children hung small bells made from cans and pieces of metal, tinkling in the breeze, celebrating life that persisted even after the storm. And so, while the crackling fire welcomed tired bodies, voices intertwined in soft chants, echoing through the night like an invisible embrace, cradling every soul into peaceful sleep. Because in the end, it did not matter how much the rain took away. The true permanence was hope, steady, serene, and eternal, like the very earth that sustains us. In the silence following the last drop, there is a peace so deep it seems to touch the roots of the earth and the starry sky afar. The village rests, nestled under simple blankets, protected not only by walls raised with effort, but by the invisible warmth that only the collective spirit can generate. It is a moment of silence and gratitude, where every sigh seems to say, "We survived, and we are still here." Opening eyes to a new dawn, the sun spills its golden light over newly repaired roofs and gutters now shining in the morning dew. The world, however uncertain, renews itself each day, and with it the silent promise that even when storms are inevitable, there is always a home, a song, and an embrace waiting to welcome those who dare to resist. And so, between the distant echo of rain and the tranquil whisper of leaves, the village learns to breathe with nature, accepting its whims and embracing its challenges. There is no hurry, no fear, only the soft serenity of one who knows that every storm, no matter how fierce, is just a passage in the great river of life. And when night falls, bringing with it the starry mantle that always surrounds us, voices fall silent, hearts slow, and sleep comes gentle as the breeze that blows through the fields. It is in that silence, that rest, that true strength lies, one that turns rivers of shame into songs of hope, forever cradling the story we tell ourselves before sleep. The end.